And welcome to this episode of the Good Citizen Podcast. My honor today to have on Joseph Kohm from the Family Policy Alliance. Joseph, how are you today?
I'm doing great, Josh. It's great to be here with you.
So I'm excited in this episode to dive into essentially what I would say that is the next chapter in protecting kids from porn. There's been some exciting developments in U.S. law, things that have been very long in the making. I'm talking 50, 60 years where Christians have been working in this space, but pretty much unsuccessfully. Being able to legally say, hey, we're not going to give kids, we're not going to give 10-year-olds access to pornography online. And so I wanted to dive in. Joseph was actually at the oral arguments in Washington, D.C. for his case called FSC, Free Speech Coalition versus Paxton. Free Speech Coalition, not very aptly named. It's basically an association of pornographers. They called themselves the Free Speech Coalition. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about how those oral arguments went. You may have heard a little bit about that, do a deeper dive there. And then we want to look forward into how can you as a church leader, as a committed Christian, what can you do to protect your children, other children from pornography online? Joseph has an amazing biography and kind of history here. He's a director of public policy at Family Policy Alliance. He leads FPA's policy strategy, provides policy and legislative expertise. Longtime listeners may remember Craig DeRoche, who has been on a couple times, who now leads FPA. But Joseph has an amazing backstory. He's a U.S. Army veteran of the 10th Mountain Division Light Infantry, a graduate of Regent University School of Law, licensed to practice in D.C. and the state of New York. He worked in the military, but then he also was a part of the Regent Law Center for Global Justice. And if listeners remember our great interview with Professor Brauch, and he was talking about their international efforts, Joseph was a part of that effort outside of Jakarta, Indonesia, combating illegal trafficking, which certainly plays into this. So Joseph, I kind of laid that out there. Anything that I missed as part of your background and what you're doing now?
No, you hit the big ones, Josh. I would just say that I'm so glad you mentioned the internship I did with the Center for Global Justice at Regent Law School, my beloved law school, and my family's sewn a lot into, because that internship, my first real experience as a law student doing legal work, is really what got me into our line of work, but specifically this line of work, as we're going to talk about with pornography. It's never just pornography. Pornography is part of the broader sex industry that includes most human trafficking, I would say. So that was the start for me getting into this, and I'm eternally grateful to Professor Brauch, one of my great professors and instructors at law school, and the rest of the team at Regent for starting me down a path that God, I'm so grateful to say, has eventually used in our work now in the FPC network.
There's certainly a number of great law schools out there, but it does amaze me how many Regent grads I run into in this space. Certainly my alma mater, Pensacola Christian, has a great relationship, sends a lot of folks there. So it was just, when I was looking that up, and I know we talked before, but just connecting the dots and the great work that's being done there. And I believe your family's kind of Regent royalty, in the sense that your mom's been a professor there for how many years?
She's going into year 32 being a professor there. She's the family law and wills, trust, and estates professor.
It's amazing. So a lot of dots connecting here, a lot of puzzle pieces falling together. And I consider Joseph a friend. I'm so grateful for his testimony and his work in the public space. So Joseph, any recent kind of success story or anything that God's been doing in your life, your ministry, that listeners should know about?
Yeah, that's kind of you to ask, Josh. I mean, your listeners, I know, will be familiar with Family Policy Alliance and us at FPA, and we're just, you guys are great partners with us at IFI. The Lord has really been fortunate to us in the last couple of years. I would say, particularly the last 6 months. We recently last year we merged with our sister ministry, Christians Engaged, to become one ministry with just different brandings. And Christians Engaged is an incredible ministry led by Bunny Pounds. Their entire vision is to generate amongst the American church and Christians to pray, vote, and engage in the political process. Pray, vote, and engage. And it's been such a privilege to partner with them as we continue to work for a country that better reflects God's character in its laws and in the lawmakers that it puts out. So that's been an incredible series of growth. And just more specifically, we're going to talk about one of the laws at issue in this case from Texas. Texas is one of 19 states that have passed a law like that, protecting kids from pornography with this technology. And FPA was so fortunate enough to be involved in probably about 12 of those in 2024. And it's part of just this wave of good pro-family legislation. We've been able to work with folks like you at IFI and our FPC network around the country to help get passed. And we just feel really fortunate that God's put us in these positions of strength. We've really gone from strength to strength recently in our policy work and in our marketing and advocacy grassroots work. So we're really fortunate to be where we are.
Well, the particular approach that I'm taking currently, I think for at least this season, God's called me into this kind of church-led, state-based strategy for renewing the United States. We'll certainly be thinking a lot about D.C. as we're recording this. President-elect Trump will be sworn into office today. So I think there are going to be a lot of opportunities federally, but a lot of these policies, whether it's life, whether it's age verification, whether it's protecting kids from harmful surgeries or hormones, so much of this can be done at the state level. And that's where I think as we go closer to the local level, closer to the local church, our people in the pew, our pastors have more opportunity to make an impact. And so I really wanted to dig into this so that people are armed with information and know what to do next. So let's jump into this issue of pornography. I was kind of laughing about, I have a filtering software many people may use, Covenant Eyes. And so doing some research for this, I'm a little worried that my accountability partner is going to be lit up with like, look at all these searches about online pornography and all this. But this is a real threat. I was looking at a recent study that something like half of self-reporting teens will say that they access pornography or they inadvertently saw it. They had access to it before the age of 13. And then something like 75% of teenagers say that they have access, or they access pornography either intentionally or inadvertently. And this is just a travesty. It's stolen innocence. The impact of porn is well documented. And so clearly this is something that needs to be done. Something needs to be done about this. And so backing up just a little bit, I'm going to try to go through like 50 years of jurisprudence and maybe a paragraph or two. But if you go back into about 50 years ago, we had a law or a Supreme Court case called Ginsburg that came up in 1964. This had to do with a magazine seller in New York who was actually prosecuted for selling a magazine to a minor that involved female nudity. And the Supreme Court basically said, look, if a law can be passed to say you have to show an ID before you come in here and you access this stuff. It's very basic, rational basis, low level of scrutiny. We're just protecting the innocence of minors. Makes a ton of sense. But then as you move forward into about 2000, 2003, 2004, there was a case called Ashcroft. This had to do with a COPA, which is a federal statute protecting kids from pornography. Just very basic. Hey, we don't want 10-year-olds getting online and accessing hardcore porn. Very basic stuff. Unfortunately, the United States Supreme Court said that actually failed the strict scrutiny test. So that basically you're having to apply this kind of vague community standard. We can't ban obscenity because, well, it's a community standard and it's not narrowly tailored. There's the famous definition of pornography by Justice Potter back in the 1950s and 60s, which was, I know it when I see it. And so the court basically said, look, it's just too vague and you cannot bar this. And so therefore, pornography has proliferated over the last 20 years. You think of 2004, the iPhone wasn't even invented yet. And so here we are, now we land ourselves in a place where more than 50% of kids said, I saw this stuff before I was 13 years old. So Joseph, I've kind of brought us up, to about 2004. Could you add in some color there on the church's efforts to engage this issue? How has the church engaged this? And then kind of the follow-up is, how did Texas take a different approach?
Yeah, good questions, Josh. Great summary, by the way, of that jurisprudential history when it comes to at least trying to protect children from pornography. As you know, the broader jurisprudence about pornography is vast and not particularly encouraging. But Ginsburg just does give us this very well-established precedent protecting kids, and I think like a lot of things, I want to say this graciously because you and I are both really committed Christians who love our local churches and our church networks that we work with, Josh. But I think protecting kids from this kind of content and really just teaching young kids about sex and empowering parents to do that. I think that the church broadly has ceded that power or tried to cede it to the government over that period of time that we just discussed. And I think that's redounded to everybody's to a bad effect for everybody, but particularly for kids. So We're going to talk about the broader sex industry, which includes pornography, prostitution, and sex trafficking. Well, that industry is dark and it's evil, and it leaves destruction in its wake. But it thrives because people don't talk about these things. They don't just not talk about the industry, but they don't really talk about issues like sex and pornography. And the church broadly has not used its pulpit powers to do that. There are a lot of good churches and a lot of good pastors that have done it, but mostly I think the church broadly, and at least in America, has really failed on this during that period of time, the last 50, 60 years. And because of that, you mentioned some of the exposure rates to pornography. I want to preface to our audience that all the statistics Josh and I will mention are likely very conservative statistics, because pornography is such a socially acceptable addiction. It's the most socially acceptable addiction, and it's so rampant, and those numbers really don't change that much for people who are regular churchgoers and people who are not, across the spectrum, for all your religious, levels of religious devotion. The pornography addiction rates and exposure rates really don't vary that much, which is an indictment on the church and its failures in this area. So I want to say, though, that this effort recently to protect kids from pornography through new technology and new laws has been led by committed Christians and people who simply can read basic research. So the way Texas has innovated here is that, well, I'll couch it in a great phrase of historic irony, Josh, which is, you mentioned the iPhone was only comparatively recently invented. Technology has indeed enabled our country and our world to be the most saturated, porn-saturated society in world history. But it's also technology that is enabling us to finally be able to protect kids from it again. Technology has developed to a point where we can almost perfectly accurately verify your age without you giving any data to the age verifier, and determine whether you can access adult content on the internet. And so all that Texas did, and these other 19 states did, starting with the great state of Louisiana, the courageous Representative Lori Schlegel, who took on the porn industry, all she did in the law was require that if you're a porn producer online, a big porn company like Pornhub, you have to verify the age of your user before you allow the user to see the content. And you have to do it through these reliable, safe, industry standard methods. And that's where we're at. That's the new innovation, and it's working. It works to protect kids. It's 99% verifiably accurate. And we see Pornhub not only not complying with these laws, but actively pulling their service from every one of these states that's passed one of these laws. So that wasn't the original intent, but that's our great hope and encouragement coming out of this effort. So that's the new innovation that we see, and that's what was being litigated at the Supreme Court last week.
So before we go further down the legal rabbit hole, in a sense, and I think it's important for folks to understand that, you mentioned the church and our lack of efficacy in addressing this. And I certainly, growing up, know that like no one would admit that they were addicted to pornography. And a few years ago, started attending just different groups where folks were actually opening up and saying, I wrestle with this, and bringing the light to that subject, I think, is the way forward. I know Josh McDowell has been doing a lot of work in this space and having support groups. We have online filtering software and such. And then last week, we had on Andrew Walker, who has a great new book, What Do You Say When? Actually speaking to your kids in age-appropriate ways, getting ahead of this. Because if more than 50% of teens have accessed, even inadvertently, pornography before the age of 13, as a parent, like, how do you get in front of that? Well, you've got to start a lot earlier. And so what are some things for just a pastor? What are some things that you've seen that have been helpful? And maybe just for the local pastor, how can he start on kind of the spiritual and cultural front in his own congregation?
Yeah, it's great question, Josh. I want to make sure I know we knew we were going to talk about this, so I have some notes that I want to make sure I get to. But I want to encourage pastors, and really all Christians especially, to really boldly talk about this, because as I said, this evil thrives on lack of awareness, which is why the Bible says everything that's done in the dark will be brought to the light. This is nowhere more true than this. And I'm glad you also mentioned parents, Josh, because that was how FPA first got into this issue, is we believe that parents have the right to direct the upbringing of their children. And that includes when and how those children learn about sex and about intimacy. And it needs to be done in an age-appropriate way, and those parents know their kids best, which is why it's their right. But in this day and age, when kids are being exposed to pornography unintentionally without their parents' knowledge or consent, that parental right is being robbed from these parents. So I would encourage pastors, first of all, empower your parents to do this. But parents are part of your general congregation too, and they also need to be led. And that's what being a pastor is. It's the great duty and obligation that God puts on pastors. And I'm not one, so I talk about this very, very graciously, and I want to be very respectful of that because it's a higher standard. But I think pastors who speak boldly about this are the devil's worst nightmare, really, because we're so afraid to talk about it that when pastors do talk about it fearlessly in appropriate ways, it turns their church into a bastion for the kingdom, particularly in this area. There's so many bad outcomes that come out of failing to do it, but when you do it well, it's such a blessing to your whole congregation and your community and the families in it. So I want to encourage pastors to preach about this. I think I've said that a few times now, especially because just as a more public example, several states have faced popular ballot measures in their elections in recent years on questions like abortion or sex and gender issues. And in a lot of the polling, the exit polling from those states where we have lost those ballot measures, I'm thinking of states like Ohio or Kentucky, what the polling showed was that evangelical Christians generally did not know what they were voting for, and thus frequently did not vote their biblical values when voting on these measures. And we can directly attribute that to evangelical pastors simply not preaching on these issues. And I just want to encourage them that that's what can happen is we can lose these ballot measures that will cost lives if pastors don't speak boldly on it. So I want to emphasize that there are a lot of good resources and pastors out there. Josh, you mentioned Josh McDowell. And I would also encourage people to look at books like The Meaning of Marriage from Timothy and Kathy Keller, Moral Revolution by Jason Valaton, I think is the author of that, the Moral Revolution blog, and a lot of the ministries that we work with together. I think of one of our great partners in this issue is Exodus Cry. They're probably the best advocates I know of in terms of awareness of the consequences of pornography as it relates to the sex trafficking industry. And then finally, the other resource I would recommend to churches is, you mentioned Covenant Eyes. I'm a big fan of that ministry and the software they provide. One of their founders wrote a book last year called The Healing Church, which is all about how churches can deal with pornography problems within their church, and especially as it regards to ministers specifically. Because as I said, I think churches have really botched this issue, and a book like that was so instructive to me personally and can be really helpful for churches in not just addressing the porn issue, but how to help people heal and get free from it.
So it seems to me there's sort of a twofold approach here. And the first one is maybe just raising awareness about the documented harms as more data comes out. I was thinking of the website Fight the New Drug, which is an explicitly non-religious resource that just says, here's the data. And you think about young men, and as I still minister to students, I sometimes just get so frustrated and even, hopefully it's righteously indignant about they face something that no other generation of men. And if you look down through the ages, of course, our sexuality has always been a place where the enemy has tempted and brought people down. I mean, you think of King David, go through the list. But to have unfettered access to that in a device that you can access in your bedroom and this perceived autonomy of the internet, that is something that no generation of young men has ever faced before or ever should face in their temptation. And then what it does, it's sex expectations for sex, even leading many young men to become so addicted that they can't even live in the real world. They can't truly enjoy their own marriage, trying to be discreet here. I mean, these are devastating consequences of the porn epidemic. And hopefully, if pastors are preaching on this, they can bring that to bear. You know, one of those Sundays where you kind of dismiss the kids and warn the parents, but say, hey, we're going to talk about this. And also the data is showing that it's not just a male thing, that there are many women that are also wrestling with this. I don't know if you wanted to dig into that side of it before I go into maybe some of the positive things that churches can focus on.
Yeah, no, I'd love to do that, Josh. So I'm so glad you mentioned that this is not just a men's issue, because I'm a big fan of Fight the New Drug. That's where I go to find a lot of the research that helps us advocate for these issues and these laws. And I know I've seen plenty of research on them showing that I would say I think the addiction rates for men right now, and this is going to be shocking to people, but the addiction rates are somewhere north of 70%, which is that should be shocking. That means you're walking down the street, 7 out of 10 people you can just bank on they're having what they would call some kind of unwanted, repeated struggle with pornography. But that research also shows that it's about 50% of women, minimum. And again, conservative nature of these statistics. People don't like to talk about porn. They don't like to admit their issues. I would say the real numbers are probably north of both of those. I want to give a shout out here to I mentioned our allies, Exodus Cry, earlier. They're working on one of their best ministry tools is their documentary films, because their president is Ben Ginolo. He's a great filmmaker. They're working on a documentary about the impact of porn specifically on women. And when we were at the court last week, Josh, we had a rally out front hosted by our friends at the American Principles Project. And Exodus Cry brought 4 victims of the pornography industry who were women to speak at this rally. And they were the best part of the day because they are so fearless. What's happened to them is so awful, but they are turning their testimonies into tools for positive advocacy. They're not even necessarily people of faith. They just know that what happened to them was wrong, and that protecting other women like them from this industry is part of what's at stake in this case. And frankly, Josh, I'm one of their victims too. For a number of years, I walked through pornography addiction, and by the grace of God and the community of Christians that I was in, God used that difficult time to pull me out of that addiction and heal me of it. But this is the point of our testimonies, is to be used and to impact other people and help other people get free. And I'm just thankful that I serve a boss who does that. You mentioned Craig DeRoche. He has an incredible addiction recovery story from alcohol addiction. And I mentioned those survivors of the pornography industry who are women. That's what God rescues us for, not just to save our souls and to make us more like him, but to help other people get free as well. So sorry about that tangent, Josh. Now that went a little way away from the bounds of your question, but I want to encourage people that when you can learn to weaponize your testimony for the kingdom, you also become one of the devil's worst nightmares.
I love that, turning your testimony into a tool. And thank you, Joseph, for being willing to share that. As I mentioned, that just was not the case kind of growing up and still in some circles. And with those stats, like the local church, I guarantee it, you're preaching on a Sunday morning, those stats probably hold true. And in fact, perhaps this is sensitive ground here, but perhaps some of the reason why the church has not spoken up is, what if our church leaders themselves are wrestling with it? And they're afraid that, you preach against it and they come out and it's a sense of hypocrisy. And so I think this is one of those issues. I had on recently an individual that Sean Tice that deals with fatherlessness. And the stats are, something like 75% of kids in juvenile prison grew up in a fatherless home. That stat should direct our action. Hello, this is one of those things that wakes you up. And those stats about pornography, I think, indicate this is something that can't be on the back burner. We've got to impact it. And so thank you for your courage, being willing to speak up. I imagine every listener, or at least almost all listeners to this episode, will have some experience wrestling with, watching a show and a scene comes up, or, typing in a website and something else pops up. And committing to sexual integrity, I think, is so important for our witness. So I appreciate that, Joseph. So that's it. Just saying, here's the actual impact. And sin leads to death. There's so many great Proverbs, I think Proverbs 5 and others, to speak about this. But then I think as you move forward, and perhaps we can get folks like Joshua Broom, who is a former porn star, adult actor, that is now a pastor and is speaking out about the harms of this and what it did to him. And so there's lots of great resources, but having accountability groups and moving forward, and we can show people a path to freedom. So we spent some time there, I think, on the spiritual side, but that is the locus of this. This is a spiritual battle. So pivoting back now to what happened last week at the Supreme Court. What is at stake in Free Speech Coalition versus Paxton? You mentioned that Texas passes a law, just says, hey, if you're going to look at this stuff, you've got to prove to us that you're an adult. We do the same for Airbnbs, all sorts of different things. And so, what was at stake in the case, and then how do you think it played out last week?
Yeah, so there's I think my initial response, honestly, Josh, is what's not at stake in this case.
Okay, fair enough.
I'll start specifically, and then I'll zoom out. So specifically, is this law in Texas, and consequently, because there are 18 other states with very similar laws, all 19 state laws are at stake. These laws are very simple, they're very common sense, and very reasonable. And that's an encouraging note from the actual oral arguments. Is everybody agreed on the record that it is a compelling state interest to protect kids from pornography. So these laws themselves are at stake. And you pointed out we do age verification in so many other industries, whether it's buying alcohol online, whether it's an Airbnb. And we got that on the record during the case too, which is that age verification is very common, particularly in the gambling industry. You have to age verify to be able to engage in that. If you're going to place a friendly wager on the national championship tonight, you have to age verify if you're going to do that. So that's what's specifically at issue in this case, and consequently, it's a state's compelling interest, and I would say their right and obligation to protect their most vulnerable citizens, which are their kids on the internet, and to empower the parents in their states, because that's what these laws do. So zooming out, what does that mean? I think kids' sexual innocence is really at stake in this case. We talked about how kids are learning about sex from pornography because they're being exposed to it without their parents' knowledge or consent. Before a parent can get in there and give them an age-appropriate and hopefully biblically based explanation of what sex is, why it's so special, and God is the author of it, they're learning about it from sex, and we know learning about it from pornography. And we know from the research at great places like Fight the New Drug that collect all this research, we know that kids are actually believing that what happens in pornography is what sex is. We also know the research shows us that most pornography videos depict some kind of sexual abuse or violence. So it's usually at least physical violence, usually also verbal violence. So kids are looking at that and they're believing that this is what sex is. And that's, you talk about losing your innocence and a distortion of the great creation that is sex, that God intended it to be in a covenantal marriage. And it's putting kids at risk too. Recently at FPA, with our media team, I produced a limited series of podcast episodes about a lot of the different things that are at issue in this case and the implications for its judgment. And I had just a heroic national ally guest on there. Her name is Heidi Olson. She's a nurse, and she talks so courageously about pornography as a risk factor for pediatric sexual assault. Heidi's a pediatric sexual assault nurse examiner. She's examined hundreds of victims of pediatric sexual assault, and it's very clear that kids are seeing the violent sex and pornography, and they are acting it out in their own lives when they're assaulting each other. So kids' innocence and safety is really at risk here, or is really at stake here. Parental rights is at stake here. This is should be a parent's right to be able to introduce this to their kids on their time, in their way, in an age-appropriate manner. We've talked about that already. I would say states and everyone's ability to oppose the sex industry, specifically sex trafficking, is also at stake in this case. Pornography is the marketing arm of prostitution, and whether we like it or not, this is going to be difficult for some people to come to terms with. But almost every prostitute in the world is a sex trafficking victim, whether they say it or not, or know it or not. They are. No one's better at talking about this than Exodus Scribe. So our ability to protect women and children and men who are all victims of that industry is at stake here, because if we can curtail the marketing arm of that industry, it will also curtail the supply and the demand. Excuse me, Josh, I'm just going to take a sip of water here. Okay. There are a couple other implications of this case, if you don't mind me saying. I would just say all of this broadly is about sexual ethics in America. So from the pornography industry, you get an expression of the sexual ethics, I would say, from what you and I would call the sexual revolution in the 1960s, which basically just said you should have sex with whoever you want, whenever you want, however you want, and the government's all going to pay for it. That is such a degradation of what God intended sex to be in its true and glorious form. And uh, it's pornography that has enabled the spread of that ethic rampantly throughout our country. So I think if you see a curtailing of the marketing arm of those ethics, I think what you see is healed and restored marriages. I think you see more marriages. I think you see less cohabitation. I think you see a lot less unplanned pregnancies and therefore a lot less abortion. And I think you see a real healing of the sexual confusion we see in our country in terms of alternative or deviant sexual identities. I mentioned that most pornography is very, very violent. So a lot of young girls are looking at that pornography and believing that that's what sex is. And their first, and I think if you're really believing that this is reasonable for them, they say, if that's what it means to be a feminine woman in sex, I don't think I want to be that. Maybe I'm a transgender boy. So I think if states are allowed to protect their kids in this way and empower their parents, I think you see healing of all these various things. And that's why I say, what's not at stake? I think our entire sexual ethics are at stake in this case.
So only everything. not a big deal. Only everything. No, and I appreciate you digging into that a bit. You think of, all right, so 2004, 2003, 2004, you have Ashcroft. You then have the smartphone, the proliferation of pornography, which cheapens or commodifies the sacredness of sex, therefore cheapening marriage. Therefore, as you said, there are proven ties, even in some of the research saying that 50% of kids under the age of 13 have inadvertently accessed pornography, also documents a much more profound engagement from the LGBTQ community. Didn't have a particular stat there, but there is a link to this. So if you're saying, all right, this very sacred thing that God designed to be within a one man, one woman marriage is just something you can access and you can just see it. It cheapens it, and therefore marriage doesn't matter. Therefore, the biblical sexual ethic is seen as obtrusive. It is seen as kind of puritanical. So I think this coming back to, hey, man-woman marriage matters. Sex is sacred. Our children are innocent. There's so much that we could, I think, win if we can just protect our kids and then go from there. So grateful
and
for you
just
to
go even
that.
further,
Yeah.
Josh. It means people don't matter either, because in post-sexual revolution America, the ethic is the most important thing about who you are, about your identity, is who you want to have sex with or how you want to have sex or whatever. Your sexual identity is your identity. So when you cheapen sex, you're cheapening people. Your whole identity is cheapened because most porn is free. So if you want to value people the way God values people, you should value sex the way he does, which is this incredibly sacred and powerful and enjoyable force, but it's only safe in the protection of a covenant marriage. So I didn't mean to interject in there, Josh, but I just want to make sure we don't. It's so easy to shrink this issue. I want to make sure we capture all of it. It cheapens everything, and most importantly, it cheapens people, which is who Christ came to die for. I mean, you could never love people more than God does, and but you could never devalue people more than pornography does.
Amen. And that was so profound, Joseph, that, I mean, this is back to, we are image bearers of God. And, oh, you Christians, you just don't want me to be able to access, you're against free speech, you're against free love or whatever. No, we are for people and their dignity. And this is stealing their dignity. That was just so profound. So basic takeaway from oral arguments that I was kind of hearing, I found it interesting that I believe it was Justice Barrett who has teenagers in her home. And when the conversation was, hey, these teens are inadvertently accessing this stuff and the filters don't work. What I understand is that Justice Barrett's like, yeah, I know. And because this is a lived experience like any other parent. But that generally there was approval. I think the justice is generally, hey, keep kids away from porn. Like that is something we need to do. If the law does nothing else, I mean, certainly it should do that. But I think the question is kind of how that might work out. Is this something that should be under rational basis? And long times listeners would know, we've talked about this. Rational basis is kind of the court just kind of eyeballing, or I think it's okay. It's the general power of the state to protect kids, versus strict scrutiny, which is kind of pulling out the legal microscope. I think that this would pass strict scrutiny. but could complicate other matters if they go there. But did you get kind of the same sense that it looks like there'll be a favorable outcome, and just the question of is how?
Yes, I did, Josh. After the rally, I mentioned I was able to go with a lot of our coalition partners to listen to the oral arguments live, and we're listening to it. We didn't really know what to expect. We thought the justices would be a little bit more severe than they were, but we're looking at each other and in some cases messaging each other like, "Are we winning? Yeah, I think we're winning."
Mm.
By the end of the day, I think we thought that probably went about 8 out of 10 that we could hope for. So all the justices agreed this is and all the parties also agreed on record this is a compelling state interest. They're very favorable towards the technology. They're all on record saying that age verification is a common industry standard and safe way to verify someone's age. And I did think they talked a lot about that, though, Josh, which is not surprising for people who work in the family issues like us. Most cases when they get to the Supreme Court, as you know, we're just arguing about the law and what the Constitution says, and they do that for a couple hours, and then the justices write a pretty boring opinion. But when our issues get to the Supreme Court, they end up having to talk a lot more about the thing itself. They have to talk about whether age verification works. They have to talk about whether porn is good or bad for kids. I think back to the oral arguments in the Dobbs case that overturned Roe versus Wade. They had to talk a lot about abortion itself and the state's right to protect its unborn citizens. And Justice Alito's opinion in that case ended up talking in great detail about that. That it's important for listeners to know that is very abnormal for the Supreme Court, but very important and very defining. And that really happened here. Is they talked a lot about the thing itself, not just the law. Though they did talk a lot about scrutiny levels, which I'll be interested to see what they do with that. I think it passes strict scrutiny, even if they decide to impose that. I also want to say both sides and the justices, well, not the justices, but both our lawyers referenced an excellent amicus brief from one of our great allies, the Age Verification Providers Association, and our partner there, Ian Corby, has been an excellent witness on the technical aspects of age verification in our battles to get these laws passed at the state level. And he and his team wrote an incredible amicus brief about the technology and how safe it is and secure it is and effective it is. And both sides referenced that brief, and they deserved that. So that was really encouraging. The justices really know that. Even Justice Kagan, who finds herself on the other side of us in a lot of family issues, even she seemed to signal some support for this. So I think we're really set up well. Hopefully, we'll get a decision. I'm hopeful for March, Josh, but I'm doubtful that we'll see it until probably June.
So it's very encouraging. I also kind of had the takeaway and listening to other legal commentators seem favorable. And even if they say, because the Fifth Circuit reversed the injunction or reversed the district court saying, this survives even under a rational basis, the lowest level of review. If the Supreme Court said that was the wrong standard, Kavanaugh seemed to signal, well, we'll at least do it in a way where we can deal with this injunction and get kids protected. So even procedurally, I was encouraged. This is certainly important right here in Indiana, where I sit. We have this law on the books, and the Seventh Circuit upheld it. I was actually at an event with our state rep. Her name is Joanna King, who championed this bill. I was with her the day that the Seventh Circuit ruled in favor and let that law go into effect. And it was such an amazing day. Not that I'm searching this, but like going to Pornhub, that page says, you can't access it in Indiana. So you talk about the effect of public policy. Mm-hmm. I also think of Dobbs, I think taught us this lesson too, 50 years of advocacy. Here we are, 1960s, where, we're struggling. Can you define pornography? You have the fight with Falwell and the pornographers, 2004. You can't do this. And Christian advocates just keep working. We know what's right, and we just keep working. Let's be faithful, and we can see those results. So I was very encouraged by the oral argument. So kind of looking down the road, and this is one of the big takeaways for the episode. Okay, if this has happened, how can we move forward? So you mentioned the 19 states, I believe, that have passed this law. So could you speak to those that would not be in those states? And even if maybe they're in a blue state that might not be interested in passing this, what are some things that Christians should be thinking about?
Yeah, I want to be really encouraging here to your argument, Josh, or to your question here, Josh, because this is a law that can conceivably be passed in all 50 states. And there is a federal option as well that we're pushing for as well. I think the federal government has a role to play in establishing mandatory age verification nationwide. That's Senator Mike Lee's SCREEN Act. FPA are public endorsers of that bill. We'd like to see it passed and signed into law in the second Trump administration. But if you live in a state that doesn't have, if you're in one of the 31 states that doesn't have one of these laws, and you can see which states have it on our website. We have a nice map showing which states have passed this. You can do this in your state. This is a very, very attractive policy to people on all sides of the aisle, of every political persuasion. I had the sincere pleasure of going to California for 2 committee hearings for this bill in last year's legislative session. And Josh, we got this bill through both committee hearings with 0 no votes, and then a floor vote on the law with also 0 no votes in the assembly. This is California, the headquarters of the pornography industry. I could see even radical Democrats, but who are parents. I would describe to them how their kids could stumble upon this without them knowing about it. And you can see the wheels clicking and the horror coming into place. And everyone rightly understands this is a compelling state interest. So I want to encourage you, whatever state you're in, you can do this. And Josh, you and Representative Joanna King are very representative of the success of those efforts. You deserve a lot of congratulations for your work on that in combating the porn industry in Indiana. You guys are very representative of how this happens. As I'm going to tell your audience, as you know, Josh, FPA has hosts a network alliance of groups like Indiana Family Institute. There are a little over 40 of them. We call these Family Policy Councils, or FPCs. So we host this network alliance, and we support them who are actually doing the really hard work of being in the state houses like you do, Josh, to advocate for these laws. So if you're not connected to your state FPC, you can find them at familypolicyalliance.com/allies. Connect with your state FPC and support them. You need to go to your state capital, call your state representatives, and tell them you expect them to protect kids from pornography. I do think we'll see another wave of this legislation, Josh, if we get a positive Supreme Court ruling here. I think once the Supreme Court says this is a constitutional way to protect kids, I think a lot of states will take their reins off and really go all in for this, because there'll be nothing to hide behind anymore. So that's one of the ways forward. Last week before the oral arguments, I spoke with some of our allies at a media briefing for this case that was hosted by our friends at the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. And I concluded my remarks there by simply saying, even if we lose this case, we're not going to stop. We're not going to go away. We're going to find some other way, because this industry is so evil and is preying on our kids. We cannot let this go. We cannot let them do this to our kids without fighting back. And at the end of the day, there's too much research showing how evil this is, how bad it is for kids and for families and for the world. I told that briefing audience that our victory here really is inevitable, and I truly believe that. Just think about this. You mentioned Pornhub pulled their business from the state of Indiana. They did it from my state too. I live in Virginia. They could have complied with these laws. They could have instituted age verification procedures that are industry standard. They did it in the first state that passed one of these laws. They did it in Louisiana, but they haven't done it in any state since. And what they're signaling by saying that, they say they're just protesting laws they think are unconstitutional. That's really not it. This is a moral statement from the pornography industry. They believe it's a positive moral good that children be able to access pornography without their parents' knowledge or consent. So by pulling their business from these states, they are saying, if the kids can't have porn, nobody can have porn. And that's why we're never going to go away, but it's also why we are definitely going to win. So I'll just also add briefly, FPA has other programs to help us protect kids from pornography and from malign influences on the internet. We have a program called the Tech Ready Family, which is a course that people can go through online to learn how to use the parental controls tools in your operating system. And we also have the School Board Academy, because a lot of this starts in schools. A lot of other issues start in schools too. And if you want to learn how to engage with your local school board, how to either be on the school board or advocate to them or work with them, I can't recommend the School Board Academy enough.
Just something you mentioned there, Scripture commands us, Christ commands us to be wise as serpents, gentle as doves. And the strategy here is we want you to say it out loud. For example, in the kind of parental rights space, like, you're actually going to take our kids if we do not celebrate the sexual revolution. Like, I want you to say that. And then once they say it, well, most reasonable people, no, I didn't sign up for that. And here, I love that in California, who's going to stand up and say, no, I'm for children accessing pornography? We know the pornography industry is creating a lifelong customer, right? If you get a kid at 14, well, then you have him until he breaks of that, or it may be a lifelong addiction. And so just calling him on that and having the law just stand up. So I love that that's what this is doing. And even, to take it one more step, and of course, these laws are focused on age verification for minors. But I do think more broadly, it's not like when you turn 18 or you reach the age of majority in your state, pornography is no longer harmful for you. And so this is an education piece for our legislators and for our communities on the harms of pornography, and that can maybe lead to some other things. I know we have 16, 17 states that declared pornography a public health crisis, and perhaps some things can be done there as well. But this is a great step in the right direction. Just anything else on how Christians can be looking down the road if the Supreme Court upholds this? Do you see other opportunities for us?
Yes, I do. So I think because we've gone through a lot of the nefarious background of this industry, I think the church can be a force to encourage your state and local governments to actually investigate the sex trafficking industry. They're paid up with a lot of the right people, so that's why it's very challenging. But as we've said, that industry thrives on lack of awareness. If you actually just peel back the layers in this industry just a little bit, you're going to see how seedy and criminal it is. And I am hoping that our new Department of Justice under the second Trump administration will be open to investigating this industry and publishing their findings. But you don't have to wait for them. You can encourage your state and local government to do that and to publish their findings and talk to people about how evil this industry is, how criminal it is. And I know personally a lot of men who had a pornography addiction, and then once they learn that what they're watching directly fuels sex trafficking, that's the beginning of the end of their addiction, because their conscience won't let them rest anymore. I think about one of my personal heroes runs the A21 campaign, which is another worldwide awareness campaign, is a great spiritual leader named Christine Caine. And she said in her typical fiery way a few years ago while I was in law school, she said, "I'm trying to put traffickers in prison. You're still watching Game of Thrones." This is not me saying you should stop watching movies or stop your HBO subscription. What it is saying is use the parental control or parental advisory guidelines on the Internet Movie Database and just see if what you're watching before you watch it includes depictions of sex that don't align with God's plan and purpose for it. Because that also feeds this industry. Softcore pornography, wherever you find it, depictions of sex that are not in line with God's plan for it, wherever you find them, they feed this industry too. So that leads me to the last thing that parents can really, and anyone listening can work on, is in your school libraries. Unfortunately, school libraries are often a place of first exposure for children too, because we'll find print pornography in there, whether it's books about alternative sexual lifestyles or just sex ed books. Sometimes they're couched in that term of sex education, but really it's not. It's just pornography for kids. And that's why it's not book banning for parents to go to their local school boards and demand that only age-appropriate materials are in their school libraries. And I mentioned the School Board Academy earlier. If you want to learn how to do that and have model policies that protect kids from this in your taxpayer-funded school library, you can learn about that at the School Board Academy. So that's where I would encourage people to also look to fight back against this malign influence on our kids and help protect their innocence.
Well, I appreciate the emphasis just first on our own heart, and then our church, and then our community, and then our state, and then our nation. And I think that's exactly how Christian citizenship is supposed to work. And this is a really exciting area in the sense that, this is one of the evils of our time. It is leading to all the things we've talked about, and we now have a tool to be kicking back. So this is a great way for Christians to get engaged. I'm grateful for, again, your courage and sharing a little bit of your own personal story, but then also the expertise you've developed in this area. So we'll be praying for that Supreme Court decision, and praying also for efforts in states and the nation as we combat children accessing pornography, the pornography industry generally. If you had a billboard on which to put a message to the church, what would you put on it?
Oh, I would tell everyone we win. Pretty simple. We win in the end because we're never outnumbered because we are constantly surrounded by the heavenly hosts in the spirit realm. God is never not with us, neither his angels and his ministers. We always have the upper hand. We always outnumber the enemy. Every good and perfect thing comes from God, and that includes America. So if you're concerned about the future for America, I understand. God will preserve what is good about America because it comes from him. And I'll also just round this out, Josh, by saying, I don't feel very courageous sharing my testimony because this is what God healed me for, is to share it. I'm just trying to be obedient. But my mom has always taught my sister and I that your best apologetic in today's world, the world we live in this sexually confused world, your best apologetic is your sexuality, how you steward it, how you live it. If the people around you know that you're not cohabiting with your girlfriend, you're not sleeping together before you get married, they will notice. You will stand out because you're so different. They're going to wonder what's different about you. They're going to see that your life is so much better than theirs, particularly in that area. And all the research shows it. Your sexuality is your best apologetic in today's world. And we try to draw that out. Recently, I filmed the final episode of that podcast series I mentioned with Christians Engaged Vice President Ben Quine. We tried to present this positive vision of this much better vision of sexuality and intimacy and romantic fulfillment that God has given us from the beginning of time. I would tell people we are going to win because that truth is undefeated. It's never going to be defeated.
Amen to all of that, and I appreciate the encouragement. It's easy to look at something like a Supreme Court oral argument, and we know it matters and it'll make a big difference. But then what do we do personally? What do we do in our own congregation? So you've been so helpful in giving us both sides of that. I so appreciate that about your work. We're praying for you and for FPA as we move forward. Joseph, thank you for taking the time to be with us. We'll be praying for that case and look forward to working with you on this issue.
Thank you, Josh. Honored to be partnered with you and be on here with you today.